everybody, hope you're doing well. Welcome back to another video. In today's video I thought I would just compile together all of the shorts that I made throughout my month-long campaign where I personally was boycotting the World Cup 2022. And I wanted to bring attention to queer figures from history instead, just to spread some of our history and just spread some knowledge and just give a place where people could come to if they didn't want to watch the World Cup or whatever. I was just doing it as something that I wanted to personally do so I could learn more about my queer history, which has been erased for so many people. So it was something personal, but I wanted to share it as well, just because I wanted to, really. And I know throughout the month I got some comments here on YouTube, and also the ones I posted on TikTok, saying that like it doesn't really matter, it's still going ahead, it's been successful and stuff. And yeah, I know it's been a successful World Cup. Okay, I just personally, as a queer person, I did not feel comfortable supporting such a major event happening in a country where queer people can literally be killed for who they are. And that's not to say that it happens, and there is obviously issues in many other places around the world. I'm not singling out Qatar or like Middle East regions, anything like that. It's just I did not feel comfortable supporting it, and I wanted to do something, an alternative. And by all means, you can say that it was successful, you can say you don't care, you don't whatever. I honestly, I don't really care about opinions like that. And thanks for the comment, I guess. But anyway, I'll leave you to pass me to share knowledge about 29 queer figures from history, and I hope you enjoy watching it, and I will see you soon. The first one is going to be Wilfred Owens, who is a great First World War poet who brought attention to the horrors of trench life and the war. By his friends, he was rumoured to be a homosexual and included homoerotic parts in his poems, especially Shadwell's Stairs, which many thought was mysterious, but is actually a reference to a popular cruising spot in East London during the time. He was mentored by a friend, Siegfried Sassoon, and they was rumoured to have shared a hot cloudless night together when he was back in England. And then Owens went back to the war, and he was killed in November 1918 on the 4th, exactly a week before Armistice Day. When his poems were sent back, many of the homoerotic parts was removed by his brother because it was illegal then. Who is dedicated to Bayard Rustin, who was a very influential figure in the African American civil rights movement and gay liberation movement in the United States. He was behind the scenes for many like big important like demonstrations and ideologies and groups, but didn't really get given the recognition he deserved because of homophobia in the civil rights movement and racism in the gay movement. And only after his death has he been awarded these notoriety. He was stated in the 1980s for saying that when someone is attacked for being gay, it sensitizes you to other forms of bigotry, and had this really like great ideology of not caring about people's otherness. Talking about a little less well-known queer figure called Ifti Nazim. He was a queer Pakistani American poet who fled Pakistan at the age of 21 to get away from persecution and societal discrimination. He is founder of Sengat, which is a group in, I believe, Chicago that helps like American South Asian people that are queer and he released a poetry collection called Naaman, which roughly translates to hermaphrodite or half woman, half man in Persian. And in it, it was the first expression of homosexuality and like homosexual relationships in the Urdu language. In Pakistan, it was quite controversial, but it did get travelled around on the underground scene, and inspired many other poets to write honest or Nomani poetry. Let me tell you about Stormy DeLaveray. She was born in New Orleans as a biracial child who faced discrimination from both sides, and she also started to pronounce very androgynous. She worked in like MCing as like a drag king, and different like performance working, and during the Stonewall Rebellion she was repeatedly arrested by the police, and many have said that she was the first to fight back and had a baton hit over her head and blood coming down. She looked to the crowd and said, why aren't you doing anything? And they went berserk. So she'd had a big influence on Stonewall and subsequent events from that, but also she worked as like a bouncer in the village and a guardian of lesbians, just because she was a very strong person and had an influence on other things like fashion. And let me tell you about Alan Turing. He was a ingenious mathematician and scientist who dedicated much of his knowledge in the Bletchley Circle during the Second World War, and decoded many important messages from the Nazis, which helped the Allied powers to win the war. Afterwards, he spent time doing research in like physics and chemistry, and came up with like one of the first ideas for information stored computer and some other like important chemical reactions. But then in 1952 he was arrested for homosexuality, and was put under chemical castration, which is one of the major reasons that led him to commit suicide at the early age of 42. I'll tell you about Sophie Lagerlöf. She was a Swedish writer, and she was the first woman ever to win a Nobel Peace Prize in literature. And she was also the first woman to ever grace a Swedish banknote on the 20 krona when it was invented in 1991. But apart from being an amazing writer, she also had a lover, a fellow writer, Sophie Elkan, and they had a relationship from 1894 to Elkan's death in 1925. I think I might have got that wrong. And they wrote thousands of letters to each other. And then later on in the 20th century, a book was published with all of the letters, which roughly translates to "You teach me to be free." And we all know of the queer flag, the gay pride flag, the rainbow flag, but do you know who created it? Today we're going to talk about Gilbert Baker. He was born in Kansas, and he served in the US military, stationed as a medic in San Francisco, where he was introduced to the queer scene. He was then honorably discharged from the army for homosexuality, and worked with many other activists in the area, making banners for the gay rights and anti-war protests and movements. With a collective, he created the first gay pride flag in 1978, which launched at San Francisco Gay Pride. And he refused to trademark it, saying it was for everybody. He then worked on many other like projects, making designs for people around the world, and continued to be an activist. And let me tell you about Jamie Gardner. He is Australian. In 1972, he came to UCL to do a PhD in mathematics, where he was introduced to the Campaign for Homosexual Equality and newly formed Gay Liberation Front. He then went on to create UCL's first gay sock and worked with the National Union of Students to create the first Homosexuals in Education conference. He then went back to Australia in 1974 and spearheaded a campaign to make homosexuality decriminalised in the state of Victoria, which it was partially done in 1980. Further on in the decade, he worked on the Victorian AIDS Coalition, and for the other 40 years he's done much work in gay and other human rights activism. And in 2019 he was awarded an OAM, which is Order of Australia. Let me tell you about Lily Elbe. She was assigned female at birth and was quite a successful painter under her birth name Ina Wagner. She married Goethe, who she had a relationship with in art school, but she wanted to start presented as a female. This was somewhat encouraged by her wife, who painted some later say like lesbian depictions and erotica, and she was introduced socially as her own sister, Lily. In 1930, she was one of the first to undergo gender reassignment surgery in Germany, and her marriage was annulled by the Danish government because same-sex marriage wasn't a thing, but she was later allowed to change her sex. But sadly, in 1931, after a failed uterus transplant, she had an infection and later died from a heart attack. Let me tell you about Gore Vidal. He was an American author and worked in politics as well. Most of his works were like socio-cultural, like comments on like society, culture, politics, history, religion, and sexuality, because in his third novel, The City and the Pillar, that was released in 1948, it was about just like a protagonist who was in a homosexual relationship, but it was different from the time because it didn't include like eroticism or anything like that. It was just sort of just like a grey, like naturalistic way of just telling his story, and this was against the time that thought of like homosexuality as something unnatural and wrong. And and he produced loads of works, and he was just a very great writer. And let me tell you about Andy Warhol. So he was an artist that specifically went into visual art genre and pop art. He made loads and loads of different like paintings that merged like celebrity culture and like advertisement and like artistic expression, such as like the Campbell soup and many other things. And he also wrote books, and his art was in like photography, like experimental films, silk screening, paintings, as well. He founded the Interviewer magazine and the Velvet Underground like music group. Just did a lot. He also coined the phrase 15 minutes of fame, but before the gay liberation movement he portrayed as an openly homosexual man, and in many of his other works he portrayed like male nudity and erotic images. Let me tell you about Sidonie Gabrielle Colette, or better known simply as Colette. She was an author and icon in the early 20th century. She did many jobs. She was an author, a journalist, reviewer, a musical star, a beautician, and she was just like, she lived her true self. She lived openly as a bisexual woman, had multiple affairs with many prominent queer women and men as well, including Napoleon's niece Mathilde de Morny, and they actually shared an onstage kiss on the Moulin Rouge in 1907, which incited a semi-riot and police had to be called as well. She best known for writing Gigi and the Claudine series of books, which had a woman who was in a bad marriage and she had a lesbian affair. Let me tell you about James Baldwin. He was an American writer who wrote essays, novels, poems and plays, in many that are very good. I haven't read any yet, but I really want to. Most of the central themes is about masculinity, sexuality, race and class, which is intertwined with like the political like landscape at the time. Most of his protagonists were African American gay or bisexual men who had like an inner turmoil and external as well, bringing attention to a homophobia and racism that was prevalent in society at the time that he wrote, such as in Giovanni's Room, which came out quite before the main gay liberation movement. He was also an activist and public orator, and had many friends and just a really lovely person. And let me tell you about Derek Jarman. He was an English artist, film producer, stage and costume designer, gardener, author. He made so many different like contributions to many different pieces of like film and art and plays and many things, but his first like mainstream task was in producing the film Sebastian in 1976, which was the first time that gay like homosexual relationship was portrayed as like something good. And apart from all his artistic talents, he also did a lot of gay rights activism with many groups and like major events, sort of like protest campaigning against Section 28, but it was still implemented. He was outspoken about his homosexuality and rights, and after contracting AIDS in 1986, tried to like make it people think that people was talking about. Let me tell you about Charlie Parkhurst. He was assigned female at birth, named Charlotte in New England, and ran away from an orphanage at age 12. Started working for Ebenezer Bouch, where he was trained as a stable hand, working with horses, and eventually a stagecoach driver. When he was 30, he moved across country to California with the gold rush, and it was here that he got kicked in one of his eyes by a horse and got the nickname One-Eyed or Cock-Eyed Charlie. He was a very, very well-renowned, like, great stagecoach driver, the greatest in the US at the time, and also got the other nickname Six Horse Charlie. In 1968, he is credited as being the first biological woman to vote in the US. And it was only after his death that he was found out to be a transgender person. Let me tell you about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Read was born in England, and her mother encouraged her to dress and act like a boy for inheritance money. And then she started working on ships and later joined the English military. And eventually her ship was captured by pirates and she converted to the pirates. Bonnie was born in Ireland, and she married a sailor and then moved to the Caribbean, where she later met Calico Jack Rackham and became pirateers with him when they found Reed. And they both portrayed as men but were women, and then Reed came up to Bonnie and she was like, I think you're a woman as well, dressed as a man. I fancy you. And that's what happened. They had a polyamorous relationship but was later captured. And let me tell you about Vikram Seth. Seth is an Indian author who writes mostly poetry but has written 3 novels, a children's book and some non-fiction as well. His most famous work is A Suitable Boy. Seth is bisexual, and he was in a 10-year relationship with the French violinist Philippe Honoré, and he actually dedicated his 3rd novel, An Equal Music, to him. Seth was the lead campaigner with many other literary people in India in 2006 against Section 377 of the Indian law, which criminalised homosexuality. When the law was reinstated in 2013, he wrote a poem called Through Love's Great Power, and it ended, to sneer at love and wrench apart the bonds of body, mind and heart, with spacious reason and no rhyme, that is the true unnatural crime. Thankfully, in 2018, the law was counted unconstitutional. I'll tell you about Tokko Laaksonen, or better known by his pseudonym Tom of Finland. He was a Finnish artist who created over 3,500 pencil drawings that were mostly based on photographs, but he exaggerated certain parts, and in his later artwork they came really close to resembling actual photographs. They was mostly all of like homoerotic men, gay men, in sort of like leathers and like police uniforms and like soldier uniforms and stuff. And this was like one of the first times that like gay men were shown as like being like masculine instead of like more like feminine and like weaker portrayals. And all of like the characters were like joyous and happy, and they wasn't like feeling any shame. It was just like good representation. And let me tell you about Renato Russo. He was a Brazilian musician, most well known for being the lead vocalist and guitarist of the alternative rock band Legião Urbana. But he also played the keyboard, the bass guitar, was a songwriter, and wrote 4 books when he was alive. At the young age of 18, he came out as bisexual to his mother, but it wasn't until 1988 when he released the song Meninos e Meninas, which translates to boys and girls, in the group, that he came out publicly. But he later stated that he felt he was pansexual. When he was in the group, that was his biggest time of success, and they sold over 25 million records in Brazil. Sadly, in the late 80s, he developed HIV and died at the young age of 36 in 1996. The band then dissembled. Let me tell you about Christine Jorgensen. She was assigned male at birth named George and served in the US Army during World War II, becoming a GI. After the war, she was honorably discharged and in the early 50s travelled to Denmark to undergo sexual reassignment surgery performed by Dr. Christian Hamburger. She then later took his name in honour of him to perform this. She wrote back letters to her family and friends in America proclaiming that she was now their daughter and she was in much better spirits because she could finally be her true self. Her letter was leaked to the New York Daily News in December 52, and in the following February she became an instant celebrity on her return to the US. She used her poise and charm and wit to spark up, to win the hearts of the nation, really, and had a very successful career singing and working in acting and performing, and then later on she lectured in different places and really pushed the movement forward for transgender people. Let me tell you about Mark Ashton. Ashton was a British gay and political activist. In 1983, he spent 3 months in Bangladesh to see his father, where he witnessed extreme poverty. Upon return to the UK, he started to get involved in political activism. In 1984, he founded the group Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners, where they supported the miners in their year-long strike of 84 to 85, and in London alone raised £22,500, about £73,000 a day. As a result, the miners were key supporters of the queer movement going forward, and in 1985, due to block voting, made sure that the Labour Party included LGBTQ+ rights in their manifestos. Sadly, in 1987, he contracted AIDS and died 12 days later at the age of 26. Many other groups later used his name to raise money for the queer community. I'll tell you about Keith Haring. Haring was an American artist who grew in the 1980s New York City subway scene, where he drew chalk drawings on a black background. He started to get more recognition and started working in colour, and featured in over 100 solo and group exhibitions and created over 50 public murals, mostly voluntarily for free for charities and hospitals and orphanages, just so we could get people to see his artwork and not pay. He mostly depicted societal and political issues, predominantly homosexuality, safe sex, anti-drugs, and the AIDS crisis. This was especially prevalent in his later work when he did contract AIDS, such as the piece Rebel with Many Causes, that tried to show how the government wasn't doing anything. In 1989, he created a foundation to raise money for AIDS organisations and children's programmes. He died the following year, sadly, but his organisation and legacy remains strong today. About Li Shutong, he is quite unknown, so I would definitely recommend researching more about him. He was a medical student from British Hong Kong, who went to see a speech being done by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a leading sexologist, and then he accompanied him on a tour of China and then around the world, and they spoke about like homosexuality and safe sex, and it was one of the first times that they collaborated that homosexuality was labelled as something natural and shouldn't be punished, and he also changed Hirschfeld's racist rhetoric in his writings. After Hirschfeld died, Tong travelled the world himself and did other work in sexology, like research. In 1993 he died and his manuscript was thrown in the bin, but a neighbour found it, and then we tried to see some of his like really like groundbreaking studies and how like bisexuality and homosexuality is so much more common than it actually thought to be. Let me tell you about Barbara Gittings. She was an American lesbian activist and is known by many as the mother of gay and lesbian liberation. In school and college, she was bullied for being gay and took to literature but couldn't find much representation. More on that in a bit. She has many accolades to her name, so I definitely recommend researching her more, but some include opening the first East Coast version of The Daughters of Bilitis in New York, editing The Ladder, which was the first American lesbian magazine. She was one of the first to picket the government in their ban of homosexuals in employment. She was influential in getting the American Psychological Association to drop homosexuality as a mental illness. She worked with the American Library Association to get better representation of queer literature, and there's actually an award for the best gay or lesbian novel in her name. About Merpo Antonia. She's a Lesotho woman who spent most of her years as a domestic worker in apartheid South Africa, but then moved back to rural Lesotho to bring up her family. It was here that she met her motswai, which is a special friend who was another woman, and they shared quite a public relationship because it was something that was celebrated in Lesotho culture, and they had celebrations and they shared gifts, but the other lady did move to the city and dealt with some social issues, so their relationship broke down. In 1992 she met with Kennedy, who was an American author, another woman, and they fell in love and they wrote her autobiography together, which was Mepo's way of sharing Lesotho culture and how they lived and the poverty, and it was really distinctive voice in literature at the time, and it also showed how lesbianism was always a thing. So research her more. About Justin Fashanu. From a young age it was clear that he excelled at sports, specifically boxing and in football, and during a school match he was scouted from someone from Norwich City and started playing for them professionally. It was here that his career skyrocketed. He scored many really great goals and many accolades, and in 1981 became the first black player to be transferred for over £1 million to Nottingham Forest. In 1990 he publicly came out as gay and featured much backlash from the media, from the other team, from the stand, from his own team, and his manager actually barred him from training with the team. He also didn't get another full-time contract after that, and his personal and public life fell into disrepute. Sadly, in 1998 he died by suicide, claiming that it was so hard to live as gay and publicly, and not a single professional male player has came out since Jack Daniels this year. Let me tell you about Eleanor Reichner. Little is known of her, but what we do know comes from when she was arrested in 1394 for acts of sodomy and prostitution with an ex-priest, John Britby, in London. She states how she was mentored by an Elizabeth Bruderer in the acts of prostitution and embroidery. She then travelled some parts of southern England, where she worked as a barmaid, an embroiderist, seamstress and sex working, and she apparently had sex with many nuns as a man and many priests and other men as a woman. In the court proceedings, because it was official documentation, they used her dead name John, so it is possible she is the first trans woman on like records, but historians at a later date stated that it was a cis woman and therefore erased her transgenderism, but we don't really know that much because it was so long ago. Let me tell you about Jeffrey Dudgeon. He was a shipping clerk and gay activist in Belfast. In 1975, he was arrested and interrogated by the Royal Ulster Constabulary for his sexual activities. He then put his case forward to the European Court of Human Rights, and in 1979 they said that it could be put forward to a hearing. The verdict was agreed upon in October 1981, and by 15-4 votes he won. This was the first time the court ruled in favour of LGBTQ+ rights, and in the following year male homosexuality was decriminalised in Northern Ireland. This led to the 1988 case of Norris v Ireland in the Republic and the eventual 1993 decriminalisation of the same law in the Republic of Ireland. It also led to the precedent that the Council of Europe doesn't allow any members to criminalise male or female homosexuality. Let me tell you about Marsha Payno Mind Johnson. She has many accolades to her name, so please do more research into her. At the age of 17, she left for New York City with $15 and a bag of clothes. Due to anti-trans rhetoric within the community, she was homeless and resorted to sex work and repeatedly arrested, but she was such a lovely spirit and gained many friends. During the '69 Stonewall riot, she became a vanguard of the gay liberation movement and was infamous within Greenwich Village. She co-founded Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries with fellow trans activist Sylvia Rivera and opened a house supporting homeless youth. She was influential in the spreading awareness of the AIDS during the crisis. In 1992, her body was found in the Hudson River, ruled as suicide by the NYPD, but it's extremely likely she was a victim of an anti-trans hate crime, something still prevalent today. Remember, we are all brothers and sisters and human beings in the human race. I do hope you have enjoyed watching these videos because this is the last one. This is by no means an extensive list, but I have tried to diversify my videos and the people I mentioned from different places around the world, different cultures, languages, different time frames, and also different people within the queer community. But our history has been hidden from us, it's been erased, it's been trodden on, so I implore you to do more research and to look into this. So today is dedicated to you. Every queer person out there, you are valid, you are loved, and you are worthy. And it's also to the future, because there's so much more we still need to change. There are still 67 countries that criminalise male homosexuality, 41 for female homosexuality, 14 with explicit anti-trans laws, and in 11 countries the death penalty can be used. We need to change this. Thank you for watching.